Hi again, everyone. We're going to give it another minute as folks join us, especially for those of you that might have stepped away for a quick break. And we appreciate those of you that have joined us for all of the sessions thus far. A few reminders for those of you that might be joining us only for this session, or for those of you that need the reminder, all of these sessions are recorded, will be made available after the event to attendees and to NACCAP folks. Second, that please feel free to ask questions throughout this session using the Q&A function on Zoom. My colleague Ben will have his eye on that. He'll collect those together and make sure that we can address as many as possible within the time constraints. As we get started on this final session, for those of you that might be joining for only the session, a reminder, some of you are quite tired of me, but for some of you, I'm new and different. My name is Mike Keene. I'm the Senior Vice President of Modeling and Client Strategy at Carnegie. My own background is in quantitative analysis, quantitative modeling, enrollment research, and then I'm relevant to much of what we talked about in the last session. And in this session, a background in leadership in financial aid at a four-year private institution. As we talked about this session and wanting to make sure that at least some of the content today was very narrowly tailored to topics that would be of particular relevance for NACCAP institutions, I had an immediate moment where I said, I want to talk about stackables. And the reason I want to talk about stackables, and I'll explain exactly what I mean by stackables, but some of you already know what I'm about to say, is that very frequently when we work with, and obviously for today, we're going to be talking about colleges and universities, NACCAP members with a Christian mission. But frankly, this is also true of other four-year privates, secular or Catholic or other religiously affiliated four-year privates. It's often even true of public institutions. It happens to be uniquely and specifically true of Christian institutions for lots of good reasons and lots of laudable reasons that I'll talk about. But the number one of the first questions we get is, what do we do about all of these special scholarships? And one of my experiences is that these special scholarships can accumulate almost like scar tissue, in the sense that they serve a purpose and they help address something in 1 year, and then they stay around for the next year, and then the next year, and then another one gets added. And then as you go over the course of 10, 15, 20 years, you start to get to the point where you've got scholarships where no one even knows why you have that scholarship, and someone is spending 15 hours over the course of the year trying to figure out how to award $2,500. And that's what I'm talking about today, are the stackable scholarships that are a particular challenge around administrative burden, that aren't allied with improving outcomes for students or improving your enrollment outcomes, and that you should consider reviewing and potentially eliminating or consolidating. And I want to present this, I guess this is going to be mildly Socratic for a Friday afternoon or Friday morning for those of you joining me on the West Coast. And that's because I want to present the case against stackable scholarships, and then present the case for them, because there are good reasons why these scholarships are developed, and we don't want to lose the good as we try to improve or the bad or address some of these challenges. So first, just definitionally, what are we talking about here? I am talking about grants and scholarships. So obviously there's institutional loans in some cases, there's institutional work programs, but really here what I mean is institutional gift aid, grants and scholarships. And specifically, I mean grants and scholarships that are principally or exclusively derived from tuition revenue. I will acknowledge that there are gift aid programs that are derived from endowments or donor sources where it's almost unavoidable that the donor agreement includes that the student has to be very narrowly identified and must file an application for the scholarship and must be evaluated on an annual basis for renewal of the scholarship. So there are things around donor. Now, obviously, donor agreements are not inviolable. Like, you can still go back to the donor. If the donor has passed away, there are opportunities in the courts to get donor agreements revised. And if any of you in this session have experience in advancement or in fundraising, you're aware that your hands are not entirely tied when it comes to donor agreements. But I want to acknowledge that for the purposes of our discussion today, there are going to be unavoidable restrictions and constraints on some gift aid that mean that because of a donor agreement or because it's derived from an endowment, it's not really going to be within your purview in the financial aid office of the enrollment division to consolidate, adjust, or eliminate those. What I'm talking about are the opportunities that are principally or exclusively derived from tuition revenue. In other words, they are derived from the exact same general ledger code, the exact same budget bucket as your regular grants and scholarships. They're just called something different and earmarked for a specific population. I am particularly talking, not exclusively, but particularly talking about grants and scholarships that are earmarked for specific populations that also require students to complete additional steps, especially additional steps that are onerous, like a significant scholarship application or a verification form that has to be required, or going back to your pastor and having to have them fill out a form and then present you with a check for a matching fund. That as we impose these additional requirements, it's not that we are imposing hurdles and we want to remove hurdles for students. That's also true. But as we've noted in some of the other sessions, there can be a downside to removing hurdles, which means that you're talking to students who might not have particular affinity or interest in your institution. But here I'm talking about specifically the sorts of really onerous hurdles that impose additional barriers for students that also tend to focus these grant resources on the students and the families that are already most likely to enroll. And as I mentioned, we're talking about grants and scholarships that apply to a specific population or group that has existing affinity with your institution. First and most immediate question, what do we mean when we say that these types of scholarships are not optimized? The short and most straightforward answer is scholarships for specific populations, affinity groups, specific student populations that require additional steps almost inevitably focus the gift aid resources on students who are already most likely to enroll. You'll recall that Nick talked through in his presentation, if you were able to join us for it, and if not, it's available or will be available soon in a recording, that financial aid optimization is fundamentally about making sure that every dollar of gift aid you have is aligned with your enrollment goals and is deployed in support of improving enrollment probability for your prospective students to maximize yield, to maximize enrollment, to maximize net revenue within the context of your mission. These special scholarships, in some cases, do the exact opposite. They make sure that they take your absolute best customers, your most likely enrollees, and focus significant portions of your gift aid resources on them, where it might be able to do additional work somewhere else. And this is sort of, financial aid optimization is often a challenge for institutions because it's an uncomfortable position sometimes to take funding from a population and give it to another population, especially if the funding that you're taking the population from is a population that you feel strongly about is a great fit for the institution or has lots of existing affinity and interest in the institution. That's the challenge of moving from a scholarship strategy, a grant strategy that makes you feel good to a grant strategy that is aligned with your institutional goals such that it develops a sustainable financial model. So when we're trying to design strategies that focus gift aid where it can make the greatest impact to enrollment, to net revenue in the context of our institutional goals, that might mean that some of these scholarships are not in service of that goal. And as I mentioned, these aren't limited to Christian institutions. They aren't limited to private institutions. They aren't limited to smaller institutions. But I will say that in our work with institutions like the NACCAP institutions and with some of the NACCAP institutions, these tend to be more frequent and they tend to be a larger portion of the overall aid allocation. Obviously, they occur at other larger institutions, other four-year, even public institutions, but they're a smaller piece of the pie. And for reasons that we'll talk about in a bit, there are specific recruitment and relationship reasons why these are more prevalent at institutions with a Christian mission. A follow-up on why these scholarships aren't optimized. Ideally, most of your application process is designed to remove barriers and make it easier for students to explore interest in your institution. You want to have the access to the broadest possible population of prospective students. There's organic and inorganic ways to do this, right? So we talked in an earlier session about the challenges around what many institutions embraced, recruiting students that are very far from campus, that have little affinity or interest, and they're sending students that are a poor fit for the institution, marketing materials, in some cases expensive marketing materials, trying to generate interest in the institution, only to find that by the time they apply and are admitted, they're not enrolling, but you've incurred significant cost to try to recruit that student. And we mentioned that the antidote to that is focusing on sort of right fit populations. So it's not that we always want to say that it's great to remove barriers. In other words, you can remove barriers in ways that result in a population of students that's harder to manage and understand and predict their behavior. But generally speaking, especially if we identify the right prospective populations in the first place, you then want to make it easy for them to express and follow through on that interest in your institution. And that can come in the form of student search and recruitment campaigns. You can see it in the form of application fee waivers, either generally or for specific populations. If your institution has considered joining the common application or another consortium application, or if you've eased application requirements, optional essays, personal statements. Many institutions have moved to student self-reporting GPA so that then they're only collecting official transcripts from students once they have been either admitted or have indicated an intent to enroll. And then obviously, and most recently, test optional policies are a way to remove barriers, either because the students weren't able to take a test or because the student believed that the test, taking the test would disqualify them from eligibility at the institution. All of these are ways that institutions have tried to remove barriers. And again, there are better and worse ways to do this. You don't want to induce and develop a pool of students that only applied to the institution because it was free, or only express interest in the institution because they knew they could get through the entire process without having to write an essay or complete a personal statement or supply an official transcript or collect a letter of recommendation. Within the context of identifying the right audiences, you do want to make sure that those students don't have undue burden, undue barriers to following through. Stackable scholarships are the opposite of that. They both demotivate students who might have modest interest in your institution, and they also, and this is really the broader point, they focus really critical and very limited gift aid resources on students whose probability to enroll is already high. An additional follow-up here, and again, this comes from my experience in the financial aid office and working on these and supervising a team trying to manage this. These scholarships, it's not just about revenue efficiency. There's also genuine administrative burden and administrative complexity that comes from these, both for the students and the families and for your financial aid officers. Processing application materials is difficult. You'll recall that in the first presentation today, we showed some graphs of an actual NACCAP institution on tuition and aid, and we didn't provide the institutional name, and we did our best to mask the institutional name. I explored that same possibility for this, and the challenge was there was no way to show like a scholarship website and all of the various scholarships that require applications or interviews or recommendations without disclosing the institutional name, or trying to do so, we were having to redact it so widely that it would look ridiculous, but you know who you are. So these are the scholarships that require significant additional application materials. So some examples that we found and we've had in our own personal experience. The baseline example is an additional scholarship application. Now, keeping in mind that if you're a student who's who's applying to 3, 5, 7 different institutions, who's considering a range of options, who's also exploring scholarships from outside organizations and local nonprofit and college access groups, that's adding another scholarship application, particularly when there are unique requirements like an additional essay, an additional personal statement, that these are students that are, at least for traditional first-year undergraduates, trying to get through their senior year of high school. And layered on top of all of the application requirements and the mountain of mail and email and banner ads that they're receiving from institutions, are also trying to manage the potential for dozens of different unique scholarship applications. Those additional requirements impose additional burden that can demotivate students pretty easily. But even more than demotivating students, it means it's effectively a filtering mechanism to make sure that only the students that really want to be at your institution are going to be eligible to receive an offer of one of those scholarships. And we also saw, even beyond the scholarship application, interview requirements for scholarships and additional letters of recommendation. Each one of those is, again, if it's one student, one scholarship application, it's easy to say, I want students to have to express genuine interest. I don't think anyone would say that it's not a good idea to collect and manage expressions of interest and motivation as you're recruiting. The challenge is acknowledging that these students might be doing the same thing at 5 or 7 different institutions, and they might be doing it across 5, 10, or 15 different scholarship applications. And that means that pretty quickly you can get almost exponential growth in complexity that students and parents are encountering during this process that can be really demotivating. It's sort of the equivalent of any other significant purchase or commitment that you are making, where instead of, a single car loan, someone said, why don't you apply for 18 different car loans? And each of them will be a small amount, but they'll have slightly better terms. There is a point at which you say enough, too much, or what you're actually doing is filtering out students who are modestly interested or who don't have additional family and work commitments where they don't have the time to complete these additional requirements, and instead focusing these resources on the students who are already probably going to be the most likely to enroll anyway. Coordinating matching commitments. Pretty frequently, we see these programs where there's a matching commitment where if the parish, if the faith community, if the church, if a group provides a scholarship, that the institution will match it. That's an additional form for the student. It's an additional form to be processed. It's an additional form to be communicated about your financial aid office. It's an additional form to be stored and attached to the student record. Again, one of these, not a big deal. 5, not a big deal. 10 different programs, 15 different students per program. It becomes very rapidly the sort of thing that imposes the additional administrative complexity that does one of two things. Either it requires you to have to supplement and hire additional staff to administer them, or the reality, and all of my financial aid folks on the call know that this is typically the case, you just add it to an existing workload for a financial aid officer. And that means that that person who is already at 110% capacity gets to go to 115. And that's the sort of thing that can lead to overload. And I think it's reflected in some of the challenges that enrollment offices and universities generally have had keeping, retaining, and investing in the development of talented and effective staff members. There's also a challenge when these are one-time versus renewable. So a one-time scholarship means that you're answering questions from the parent and the student about, is it renewable or not? Back to one of my very first slides today, which is, oh, by the way, it's a multi-year contract and it might cost more next year and you might not be eligible for this discount anymore. If it is renewable, and ideally it's automatically renewable, you're still managing automatic renewal. If it's renewable, but it's based on a particular GPA, or if it's renewable, but it requires sort of a recertification, each time there's additional administrative complexity that has to be managed by a person in an office, and typically the financial aid office. The other piece is that even when all of this goes smoothly and all of it's automated, each year the financial aid office, as they're packaging continuing students, either on a per student basis or on a programmatic basis, has to update these packaging routines, these packaging parameters. And the more of these additional ad hoc scholarships you have, the more complexity there is to manage, the more likely they are to slip through the cracks or not package correctly, or package for a student when the student shouldn't be eligible. And then you're in the position of taking a scholarship away. And last, and certainly not least, students and parents want clarity in terms of process and procedure and rules. And that means that every time you have a scholarship program that has a unique set of requirements, ideally you are communicating effectively about that, which means you're maintaining a separate communication of terms and conditions, which means that you're maintaining a separate review of terms and conditions on an annual basis, ideally, or the aid officer is having to double check eligibility each year for each award level. Again, 1 scholarship, not a big deal. 5 scholarship programs, 10 scholarship programs, that complexity can snowball pretty quickly. So those are all of the reasons why we typically don't love stackable scholarships, and why we sometimes believe that they are at cross purposes with making the most of especially tuition revenue dollars in aligning your gift aid resources with your enrollment goals. There are, of course, good reasons to have these scholarships, and we want to acknowledge and give those voice. Stackable scholarships are obviously designed and if executed well, can continue to build relationships with outside parties, with recruitment partners, pastors, congregations, other organizations that serve as advocates for your institution and help you expand your reach in a very organic way, such that it's not a student getting a postcard saying, come to the university. It's a student who has a personal recommendation from a pastor, or it's a connection through the local church, is a connection through a local Christian men's organization. That there's a variety of different organic recommendations and sort of brand affinity is how we would put it, not to be crass, but the reality is, are these folks that are going to promote you in the community. And stackable scholarships often are born as a strong commitment by the institution to go into a parish, to go into a church community, to go into an organization and say, we feel so strongly about your ability to be an advocate for us in your community that we want to put our money where our mouth is, right? And that's how they start. And then it's 5, 10, 15 years later where they are the administrative challenge. Stackable scholarships can also give you access to key populations of prospective students. So again, this is about what are students hearing about your institution from trusted members of their community, whether that's in their faith community or in other organizations, whether it's in their church or outside their church. Are these scholarships that are creating the opportunity for you to have access to members of a congregation that are anticipating enrolling at a college in the next 2 or 3 years? Not least, especially if we have anyone on here who has current or or former responsibility for advancement or fundraising. One of the examples of these scholarship programs that occurs at lots of institutions outside Christian institutions or NACCAP schools is an alumni or legacy scholarship. And these are things that are in some cases torment financial aid offices because they require admission and financial aid offices to effectively identify legacy or family connections at the institution, to process the scholarship. And the reality is that it's a milder example, but it's another example of giving additional tuition revenue dollars in the form of gift aid to populations that are already far more likely to enroll. But advancement loves those, right? Because it helps continue to build that affinity with alums. And when you can build that affinity with alumni, you can build that affinity with donors, these sorts of very clear and demonstrated commitments to matching funds, to these scholarships for specific affinity groups are important to your advancement and fundraising colleagues, because that's the currency effectively of that work. So I don't want to diminish that. And it's another reason why I think we can consider almost partly excluding donated and endowed sources from this conversation. Those have all of the same drawbacks around administrative complexity and around the challenges of maintaining and updating and packaging and communicating them. But they at least have the added bonus of helping other colleagues at the institution build, maintain, nurture those relationships. It's also entirely reasonable to say, hey, lots of businesses give discounts to their best customers. That what we are doing here is giving a discount, giving the opportunity to achieve an additional scholarship to the populations that are most mission-centric, that are most critical to our faith mission, to our institutional mission. And I would say you're absolutely right. I would say businesses that give discounts to their best customers typically do that because they want to build the affinity that keeps their customers coming back. And except for when you are giving a scholarship to the oldest of 7, and you think you might be generating some pretty good repeat customers, I think the reality is that that's not the case for families that are considering an institution for 1 child or 2 children. And that means that it's a slightly different sort of purchasing psychology and a slightly different rationale behind focusing discounts on your affinity populations than you would find for other goods and services, where it is quite frequent and in fact almost routine to give discounts to existing customers and your best customers. There's a compromise, I think. So as we walk through against stackables, right, administratively complex, focusing resources on students who are already quite likely to enroll, which means that you have less gift aid to focus on students where that can be the difference maker in their decision to enroll. On the plus side, obviously, these build, they start and nurture these relationships with these key affinity groups and populations, where these can give you access to more students and access to opportunities to recruit in a way that's authentic, and where you know you are recruiting in a population where these students are also have strong recommendations from respected community members for your institution. So between those two, I think there's a compromise. And the compromise is about an honest assessment. It's an honest assessment of how many students receive each of these scholarships and in what amounts. Meaning that, are we talking about 5 scholarship programs that each award about $100,000, where you say that's a significant allocation, that's worth the administrative complexity? One of the challenges of this work is that it is as much complexity to administer a $500 or $250 scholarship as it is to administer a $5,000 scholarship. And that's why we sometimes see rapid diminishing returns on administrative complexity versus the lift that scholarship is giving you in your enrollment efforts, depending on the amount. So if we're talking about 50 different scholarships that are awarded in increments of $500, that could be a different conversation than 5 scholarship programs that are awarded in significant amount and therefore are require less administrative complexity to administer and make a bigger difference in enrollment. I think you need to talk to the folks that are actually doing the work processing these application materials. If that's in admission, if it's in financial aid, if it's in separately in enrollment, if it's elsewhere at the institution, we need to come to a sense of, are you spending more time processing this? Are you having to hire additional staff or overburden existing staff administering programs that are not giving you much bang for the buck when it comes to focus on access or on enrollment? And I think this is something that would probably have some of the biggest delta. If you were to ask a typical enrollment leader, how much time do you think your financial aid office spends administering these scholarships? And then ask the folks in the financial aid office, how much time do you spend administering these? That the gap there might be significant. It is easy to underestimate the amount of time and energy and complexity and room for error that comes at administering these scholarships. And that means that we need to be honest about how much time are we spending on it? How much time what else could we spend that time on? And what would make the biggest difference for our enrollment effort, either for new or continuing students? It's not unusual. I mentioned that there's donor agreements, right? Donor agreements might impose requirements for scholarships that are almost unavoidable, and that's fine. We routinely come across scholarship opportunities that require or that have requirements that are either already collected on the application for admission or could easily be collected on an application for admission that instead are collected via a separate application. So each time that you ask a student to indicate if they are the dependent of a minister in a particular congregation, when you're also asking them on the application what their parent's employer and line of work is, and every time you ask something in a separate application or by a separate form that you could collect in a checkbox on an application, that's an additional administrative complexity, it's additional processing time, it's an additional hurdle for the student. When you could collect that and using the information from the application, identify an eligible population and allocate that aid in potentially 1/5 or 1/4 of the time, using the exact same constraints, the exact same eligibility requirements. This is probably the most difficult, but also in many ways the most critical. Do you have data that suggests that these scholarships meaningfully improve yield or enrollment probability? The best way to do this is to engage in a predictive modeling exercise like what Nick laid out. I will acknowledge that a custom predictive modeling exercise to assess the effectiveness of stackable scholarships at a small tuition-dependent institution is not a realistic possibility, but that doesn't mean there aren't still shortcuts to this work. And that means that if you look at a scholarship and the yield is 100%, in other words, you had 5 applicants and all 5 enrolled, or you had 10 applicants and 8 enrolled, or if you had 50 applicants and 40 enrolled, there's a pretty good chance that that scholarship is not the difference maker in that student's enrollment, but rather is attracting students, is structured in such a way that the students who receive the scholarship, that achieve the scholarship, are already overwhelmingly likely to enroll. And really that gift aid could have been better focused elsewhere on students either that had more significant financial need or students that where their enrollment probability was lower, where that could have been used as a boost. Last, and I think this is probably where I have the least direct understanding to offer to you, but which I think is important, is that frequently when we talk to institutions about these, there is a concern that sunsetting some of these scholarship programs will unavoidably and irreparably damage a relationship with a faith community, a pastor, a church, a nonprofit organization, or all of the above. And it suggests that there are not ways to build and nurture these relationships such that you can have the endorsement, that you can have a trusted a trusted endorsement of your institution in these communities without having a scholarship devoted to them. But actually in the NACCAP conference just recently, I know that there was a church relations session that presentation is available on the NACCAP website and doesn't make any mention of creating a scholarship program earmarked for members of that faith community or that parish or at the discretion of that pastor. It has all sorts of other great ideas for you to develop this affinity, for college planning workshops, for financial aid or FAFSA workshops, for making sure that you have the opportunity to be in these communities as a trusted voice for explaining the college application process, explaining how to go through the process of considering different institutions, maybe even very direct FAFSA workshops so your aid staff can be working directly with students and families, answering questions or having them completing the FAFSA with you. So there are all sorts of different opportunities, and many of them in prior NACCAP presentations that give an opportunity to engage, to develop this affinity, and to ensure that you are a trusted provider of Christian higher ed in these communities in a way that doesn't require $1,500 is awarded to 10 members of the parish each year or 10 members of the faith community each year. So I think the funniest thing in some of this work is that we will frequently work with institutions where we will say, let's reconfigure your scholarship strategy. And then we talk honestly about risk and opportunity, right? What are the risks of installing a different scholarship strategy? And often those risks are significant, right? If this works well, you could see an improvement, 15 to 20 additional students. If the challenge is that it could be $200,000 of expenditure risk, and we talk through this, and often there's an acceptance of that risk because it is worth the payoff. And then we'll say, you're also giving out $25,000 in the form of 25 $1,000 scholarships to members of this local faith community. And they say, oh, we can't touch that. That's inviolable, right? And I don't think it's amusing. I think sometimes it's frustrating for us because it's a fundamental misalignment of risk and opportunity when institutions are willing to take big gambles, are willing to make a big bet on a new tuition revenue scholarship or a new scholarship and grant strategy, but aren't willing to touch some of these sacred cow scholarships that in some cases have run their course in even the initial boost that they gave in terms of establishing and nurturing a relationship with trusted members of the community. So again, I am not here to tell you that you should get rid of these. I'm not here to tell you that you should get rid of all of these. I am here to say that it is worth either internally or with a partner, if you work with a partner institute or a partner organization, to come to an honest assessment of what is the bang for the buck? What is the improvement in the enrollment outcome? Is this a difference maker for students? How much time are our financial aid officers spending administering these scholarships? Is that time that's overburdening them such that we have higher attrition? Or is it time that they could spend doing other things that might have more significant impact? And can we have an honest conversation with our partners in the community about ways that might be non-monetary, but still ensure that you have a presence in these communities such that you are the most trusted provider of education, of higher ed, of Christian higher ed, and that they'll endorse you without having to manage 15 different scholarship programs, each of which has an application or an interview or an additional letter of recommendation, and each of which has an annual process to assess renewal. So with that, I think we've got about 10 minutes or so for questions. If any questions have come up, I acknowledge that this doesn't have quite the depth or the breadth of the topics previously, but it's something that I hope is relevant for those of you, especially in aid offices who confront these challenges every year, and hopefully gives you the opportunity to have an honest conversation with institutional leadership, with enrollment leadership about the best way to configure and execute on these scholarship programs.
Thank you, Mike. Question. One issue we face is contingency awarding for students who are playing our awards against a known competitor. How should we handle this? And I know that wasn't directly related to, and maybe that was in relation to maybe filling in that contingency with a named scholarship, for example.
Right.
Student comes back. I don't want to read into the question too much, but go for it.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a question that could equally well have been asked to Nick's session earlier today. And it's a question where there's a blog written by yours truly about financial aid appeals on the Carnegie website that we'd be happy to direct you to, because fundamentally this is about appeals or requests for reconsideration. It's about what you'll sometimes see referred to as aid negotiation, right? Where you say, here's an offer I received from XYZ institution. They're offering me more than you are. Can you match? The reason that it's relevant to both this conversation about stackable scholarships, but also generally to aid optimization, is there are good reasons why enrollment offices will grant financial aid appeals, even when the student doesn't present with a change in financial circumstances that could lead to what the Department of Ed calls professional judgment, right? Actually adjusting inputs such that the student might be eligible for more aid, whether from the feds, from the state, or from the institution, but rather just, can I get more? And the challenge here is that this is much like these scholarship programs. It tends to focus gift aid resources on students who are already very likely to enroll, but it has an additional emotional hook for an admission counselor or an enrollment leader, which is that it is really, really difficult, because you spend all of your time learning to and being trained to recognize that interest and nurture it. It's really hard to say no to students when they say, I'm at a decision point, I just need a little bit more. The problem is that when we've actually done work on this in larger scale settings, and when we've had the opportunity to do it in like almost a natural experiment setting, these aid resources rarely contribute to positive outcomes on enrollment, not because they don't contribute to enrollment probability. They can, right? There's no way that if you gave an additional $1,000 to a student, the student would say, well, now I'm less likely to enroll, right? But what it does is sometimes give away money faster than it generates the net revenue to fund it. So if you give out 50 $2,500 appeals, and I should have said $52,000 appeals because I'm doing less math in my head. You've spent $100,000. If you collect $10,000 net tuition revenue per student, you need that to result in the enrollment of at least 10 more students to actually pay for that. And the challenge is that by the time a student requests reconsideration, they're already more likely to enroll. And so we've done this work where we've had institutions where the institution said, okay, as of March 1, no more approved appeals, where we got sort of an actual experiment where we could look at appeals that were granted and appeals that were refused both before and after the deadline. We've seen yield rates just as high in appeals that were not granted as we have in appeals that were granted. And part of this is that that signal from the appeal actually gets weaker year after year as this message permeates the world of the college process, that you should always ask for more, right? That every spring there's a series of op-eds in the Wall Street Journal and in other local newspapers saying, always negotiate your financial aid. What's the worst they can do? Say no. And all of that comes together to mute the signal of this is a student who's really intentional about enrolling, and instead comes through as this is a student that either is already going to enroll, or this is a student or a family who has decided to ask for additional aid at every institution, knowing that that's not an ineffective strategy for students and parents. So the very short answer to what was a very long prelude is that I think the institutions that do best have a financial aid appeal or a request for reconsideration process that does recognize families where the financial circumstances have changed such that they have additional financial need, but do not engage in that regular negotiation or what you'll sometimes hear called as pure merit, right? Families that don't have remaining financial need are just looking for additional aid. That doesn't mean that you can't have a clear process to say, you know, unfortunately, we do not consider requests for reconsideration except on the basis of the change to financial circumstances. But it means that you will spend less time negotiating and saying, here's their offer, can you match it? Because the reality is that for many of the same reasons, those are not particularly optimized, partly because they tend to give away net revenue faster than they boost enrollment to generate additional net revenue. I will say selfishly, when I was an aid director, I didn't mind those appeals because I always wanted to see what the other institutions were putting in their financial aid letters. So it was a great way to see 10, 15, 20 different examples of other financial aid communications. So there's real value in that. I just don't think that engaging in that sort of negotiation, except when there's been a change to financial circumstances, is aligned with revenue efficiency in the same way that some of these stackable scholarships inevitably give additional gift aid to students who are already very likely to enroll.
Very helpful. Next question. Our institution does an automatic legacy award. Our challenge is, how do we define legacy compared to competitors? Is there a standard? Some would say a sibling is legacy. Some would say one grandparent. Some would say you must have two parents. Is there a unified standard that you would recommend for us to proceed with legacy awarding?
I'd say that in my experience, the standard, at least to the extent that this is what we've seen most frequently used, is the child or sibling of an undergraduate alum of the institution. And the reason I say undergraduate alum is because we'll sometimes run into challenges where a parent might have received a certificate or a short-term education program at the institution. Is that where you want to, you know, does that family have the sort of affinity and investment in the institution that you want to recognize with the legacy scholarship? I don't know. I've also seen the sibling piece be executed separately as just genuinely directly a sibling discount for multiple siblings enrolled at the same time, which I think is more effective to the extent that it demonstrates affinity for families that are already making a commitment to the institution. I have seen versions of this that include aunts and uncles. I've seen versions that include grandparents. I've seen versions that even include cousins. That's pretty ineffective at that point, because again, by then you're starting to focus resources on populations that could be focused elsewhere. I happen to think legacy scholarships are not particularly efficient on enrollment and revenue generally, but that is an example where I acknowledge that they help do work for your colleagues in advancement. They help nurture and contribute to the development of the university-wide community for your alumni. So there are reasons that are not about revenue efficiency to do those. I would say the traditional eligibility would be sibling or child.
Here's another question. Are stackable awards typically offset through need? Is that what you generally see?
I think that if the question is, are stackable scholarships typically earmarked for students on the basis of financial need? I don't know that that's the case. I think for when we have donor or endowment restricted funds, there will often be a consideration of financial need. And I think that's helpful. To be honest, the gold standard for a financial aid officer is a swappable fund, not a stackable fund, because if you can communicate to the student that that their scholarship is made available partly through the generosity of the alumni and donors of your university, and that means that you can swap $1,500 of their merit scholarship for a named scholarship or a donor or endowed fund, that means that you're able to focus that such that you can communicate a single offer of gift aid to the student and then on the back end rearrange it. There are challenges there, right? So no student or parent loves it when a aid package changes and the actual bottom line didn't change, but it gives more flexibility to the institution. When those occur and those are focused on financial need, I think can be really effective because they can contribute to you being able to make a more confident offer of a need-based award up front, knowing that on the back end, I've got 15K in this fund and 20K in this fund and 30K in this fund that I can cobble together and blend in to reduce the reliance on tuition revenue dollars. Separately, when we look at these stackable scholarships, quite often it's more about affinity membership than it is about financial need. And that's the additional challenge then, is that if you're looking to focus your gift aid on families that struggle with the ability to pay, then scholarships that don't include a need component are one more check against that strategy.
Last one, and this might be from pointing back to your earlier session. Will there be a published SAI crosswalk that is scheduled to come out showing SAI and Pell levels similar to what has been produced for EFC?
So my understanding is, and what this person is referring to is, there is a table that the feds publish every year. It is unbelievably complex in the sense that it's got like 25 columns and a couple hundred rows that goes by within cost of attendance and within like half-time, three-quarter time, full-time, has an actual table where you can say, okay, for this EFC and this cost of attendance, here's the Pell amount. My understanding is that will still exist for students who are Pell eligible, but don't fall into some of the automatic buckets, right? The non-income tax filer, the students who don't fall into the max Pell for being under either 175 or 225% of the poverty line in their state based on whether it's a single or a two-parent household, and then the other more sort of limited things that will direct a student into one of those max Pell buckets. My understanding is that there will be more students that flow into those maximum Pell buckets, and that means there will be fewer students that have a Pell of somewhere between $600 and $6,000, but that there will still be a Pell table available that will result in that calculation. That's probably something that you should double check on. It's something that should be in the Department of Education's resources for laying out what will be available over the course of the next 6 months. But my understanding is that there will still be a population of students that goes into effectively a Pell table that calculates eligibility. But that's something I would say trust but verify. So thank you, Ben. I also want to mention, especially for those of you that stuck with us through all four, or at least a few of these sessions, how much we appreciate your participation today, your very good questions. I want to provide here both my email address and Nick's email address. That we are always open to questions from institutions. We're always open to conversations about how we can help, but sometimes that might just mean a clarification or a follow-up on an item that came up today. I also want to express our gratitude again to NACCAP, to Phil for co-hosting with us today. It's certainly our hope that this has been a resource for you to either give you action items for the next few months, if that's about the FAFSA, if it's learning a few new things about predictive modeling from Nick's presentation, if it's having a different appreciation for college pricing and aid from the first presentation. that either in a general professional development sense or in a very specific action item sense, that today has been helpful for you. We thank you very much. We will be following up along with your friends at NACCAP to ensure that you have these presentations and links to the videos of these presentations. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your Friday and a very good weekend. Thanks all.